Uh, well, actually, I think he was more excited about seeing his friends than the conference.
Well, yeah, yeah. Um, that's often the best part of a conference is getting to see your nerd friends.
Well, it sounded like it was a little bit removed from Lonergan.
Yeah, a little bit. I think when Bob Doran set up his International Institute for Method and Theology, which is really sort of um, a set of teams, sort of loose teams of scholars, usually headed by one person. I'm the head of the philosophy one. Um, he set it up around five areas: uh, philosophy, systematic theology, hermeneutics and scripture, integral ecology, and one I forget.
He had
Uh,
quite a vision just to come up with the categories.
yeah, no kidding. I think it was something that Lonergan kind of always hoped could get on its feet too. I think Lonergan pictured it being in Toronto. Um, I think the integral ecology thing was really something Bob thought was quite morally important. He's certainly not wrong on that score, and Pope Francis underlined that. But uh, but also, how essential Lonergan's thought is for that, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, I was as I talked to Ryan, he said something similar. He wasn't quite sure how the ecology tied in, but
Well, and um, you know, uh, I think Ryan and I are probably in agreement that in contemporary American Catholic theology as a professional discipline, um, effusive moral sincerity is sometimes rewarded more than rigorous intellection. Um, it'd be cool if we could have people who could manage both, but we are mere mortals and sometimes a little less.
yeah, yeah. I did mention to Ryan, and not an immediate thing, but I would like to have a conversation, do a podcast with three of us,
Right.
and of course I have to a little bit just to even host the podcast. I probably should be able to so I may need to come up to speed a little bit, at least under the pretense of. But I
Yeah.
would really enjoy that if.
Figure out what you want us to talk about and
Okay.
show up and do it. Um, but I didn't get any emails from anybody. Are people just kind of rolling in late, or do you think we're going to be light today? Have you heard from people?
Well, I think people are still coming in. I'm hoping I did send out an announcement about daylight savings,
I saw that.
and anybody that's in a state that doesn't do that may forget. And I kind of forgot who we have in foreign countries. We got one
Got
person
at
in
least one, yeah.
in Taipei, and they may not be. I think it's like 3 a.m.,
Yeah.
Taipei. So that I don't think they're gonna be joining. So I know several um are watching the video. So yeah, don't ever the you got people that are participating, even if they're not showing up. So uh,
That's
don't
fine.
gauge your in spirit of enthusiasm by the actual faces that show.
Okay. I've been
If
teaching undergrad
if
long
people
enough.
have been late, they've been late all week at this point. So
Wow, that's a fair
because
point.
of daylight savings time. So
Yeah. Ryan and I were sharing a hotel room in Milwaukee, and we went out to late dinner with people, and then went to the bar and had a couple of drinks, and then we're climbing into our respective beds, and we both went to set our alarms when we went, ah, damn. we're gonna lose that hour tonight before we have to get up and get on planes or trains in his case. But
Well, people are still coming in here.
yeah.
So it's not a just-in-time crowd. Well, it is almost just in time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Working on my citrus here.
I thought this week it was a much more accessible, immediately accessible, even for someone of my caliber. So,
Well, and more more obviously on properly theological topics.
yeah.
So if one has that training, it's a little more of a direct route. Though I was just posting on Blue Sky that it occurred to me one could structure a semester-long course around all the stuff he crams into this essay. There's so much stuff wedged into it that and the he gave a version of a highly revised version. I should put it the other way. This is a highly revised version of a 1961 talk that he gave a number of times up with the same title. And in that one, he talks about like the French debate about Christian philosophy and stuff, and he totally excised that here. So that version has even more stuff wedged into it. Um,
Is
so
the
yeah,
is the term that he's landing on Christian realism?
yeah, yeah. I think so. I think he wants to say that there is a um, at least tacit realism that is distinctly Christian insofar as it emerges um, within the Christian community discussing explicitly Christian things.
So I know the guy that did so much work, I forgot his name, that did so much work on realism was actually Hindu. And I always,
Oh,
and so when you say realism, I always thought, well, probably you need to specify.
um, yeah. One of the tricky things is there's some kind of merely verbal connections. I always forget the guy's name, but there was another guy who is a contemporary of Lonergan's who also used the description critical realism, which Lonergan uses here. And so sometimes people will be like, "Oh, well, he must be referring to this guy," and he's super not. It's just a kind of
Yeah.
um, verbal coincidence. Um, and so, those things always get tricky too, when you try and figure out who's talking about what. But okay, well, hey, I'm gonna keep peeling this orange, but let's get going. And as always, I have a few things I want to zoom in and look at, but I'm gonna hold those in abeyance because I prefer to begin with your questions.
I've got a question. So he seems to be saying at the end of the essay that it was the church's wrestling with doctrine and trying to unpack um, revelation that led to its engagement with philosophy um, and then assuming his own development of critical realism. So I was wondering, like, what does that mean for the relationship between theology and philosophy, or spirituality and
Hmm.
philosophy, both in the history of the church and specifically with Lonergan? Like, does Lonergan's philosophy by necessity relate to divine revelation or a spiritual experience of divine revelation?
Good. So let's look at let me pull up my copy here. Um, at one point, Lonergan says, um, give me just a second while I find it. Just want to make sure I have a particular place in mind. Okay, so I'm going to look at the top of 206 here. And at the top of 206, he's been making this contrast between the world of immediacy and the world mediated by meaning. He's using world here in a kind of broadly phenomenological sense, right? In the sense of Welt as Husserl and Heidegger roughly would have used it. Um, I must add certain further features to round out the picture and perhaps forestall objections. The recurrent difficulty in cognitional theory and in psychology generally arises from a failure to distinguish between our actual performance and our abbreviated objectification of that performance. Both the world of immediacy and the world mediated by meaning are abbreviated objectification. Um, Consciousness of the world via this kind of the immediacy of the given and consciousness of the world through the mediation of meaning are both ways of being a subject. They're both sort of qualities of presence in a subject. They're conscious. And so he's using them as abbreviated objectifications, which is to say he's trying to make an object of these ways of being conscious. He's trying to make an object of consciousness out of these ways of being a conscious subject. So they're objectifications. They're not full accounts of what actually occurs, but they are fair approximations to the accounts that people are prone to give of their own performance. Inasmuch as they are fair approximations to what people think they do, they are also fair approximations to the There are also fair approximations to the confusions in which cognitional theory becomes involved. Infancy, as studied and described by Jean Piaget, is a time of enormous operational development. It is a time in which we learn to use our limbs and senses to coordinate different uses and all their possible combinations. Piaget has this big study of the development of intelligence in childhood, but he also has a kind of précis of his study that's just called Intelligence, and it's an English translation, and it's worth reading. It's really very good. And I like the short version because you're less likely to get distracted by his description of the various stages, and you're more likely to get his the thing Piaget was actually interested in, which is what's the mechanism of development that tips you between developmental stages. This is a big problem with Piaget, is people object to Piaget's descriptive stages because they're sort of their empirical basis is very weak. He was talking, there were like 6 kids in his parlor or whatever, like this tiny data set. But the thing that Piaget was more interested in is the dialectic between assimilation and accommodation that generates the adaptive development of as these different systems come online, and sort of how these operations accumulate to reach these different equilibria. Anyway, so that Lonergan sort of is famous for this thing he's going to invoke somewhere else here about sort of people thinking of knowing as just looking. Well, the funny thing, and by looking they mean just the kind of immediate confrontation with reality. Well, the funny thing is when you read Piaget on the development of ocular vision, there's actually all kinds of really complicated motor and sensory and intellectual operations that have to come online and get constellated so that, in fact, even looking is not immediate. Looking is mediated by all these very subtle constellations that becomes ocular skills in looking in childhood development. So this is the point he's making here, right? Is that it is the time in which we learn to speak, and so to learn to move beyond the immediate to the world mediated by meaning. All this is true, but it would be untrue to suppose that the infant is a strict empiricist, right? Where things just sort of passively go in, right? The infant's activity may be predominantly on the sensitive level, but there is no reason to suppose that intelligent activity is to be excluded. Again, the entry into the world mediated by meaning does not exclude immediate consciousness of the operations by which that entry is affected, right? So there's a constellation of conscious operations that affects the mediation. On the contrary, it is only by the objectification of such conscious operations, of our acts of understanding and formulating, of reflecting, weighing the evidence and judging, of deliberating, evaluating, deciding, that we can reach any real apprehension of the mediation that meaning affects, of the broad and the fine structures of the world that meaning mediates. Why is this at all an answer to your question? For for Lonergan, um, insofar as one is engaging a world mediated by meaning, and he says in the next little bit here that Christianity is present in a world mediated by meaning. Um, and because it's present in a world mediated by meaning, the what he calls the ambiguity of realism affects it. And so the operative definition, the sort of spontaneous anticipation of what reality must be, shapes what in that world mediated by meaning people are willing to affirm as real. And beyond that, not only what they're able to affirm as real, but in fact how they're able to think about what kind of things make sense in the world mediated by meaning. So he gives the example in Tertullian, right? Uh, God has to have a body because things that don't have bodies aren't real, right? Well, that's a spontaneous anticipation of what the real is, um, and it's affecting his theological judgment. And his theological imagination, his theological um, questions, so forth. So okay, so so your question is about how does philosophy relate into this, right? So in that case, at one level, there's a tacit philosophy, right? Sometimes I hear people say sort of everybody has a metaphysics, right? There is some kind of um, tacit or implicit uh, anticipation of what's real or whatever, or what thinking is, or so forth. And now you can treat that as a kind of implicit philosophy of reality, which is what Lonergan's doing here. Now, if you want, you can take your stand on the idea that, well, until that tacit anticipation or implicit anticipation is objectified, right? It's made explicit. The French would say, thematized. It's not really a philosophy yet. And so, in a certain way, you're not really going to get Christian philosophy until you get scholasticism, until you get the sort of questions getting disaggregated and treated on their own terms. Maybe we can have that fight, right? In the 40s, Blondel and Gilson and a number of other people all had that argument. But Lonergan here at least seems to be operating on the idea that philosophies can be tacit and operative, or they can be explicit and objectified, but they're philosophies either way. But really, what he's taking a stand on is that they have their ground in um, the philosophies have their ground in the activity that concretizes them, which is an abstract way of saying they're revealed in the way people think. And okay, so and then your last piece was about spirituality. Um, a- a- for Lonergan, um, Lonergan has an interesting thing. Hold on, let me eat this piece of orange and think about how I'm going to answer this part. So Lonergan pulls an interesting move in this essay where he says, "Hey, in addition to the immediacy of our sensitive encounter with the world in a way that's really obvious in the infant, because they don't have language on board yet, there's also the immediacy of our relationship to God." And it takes two forms actually. He doesn't distinguish them here, but for him there really are. It takes two forms. There's the general immediacy of our relationship to God, which is the light of age and intellect in Thomas, or the pure and unrestricted desire to know in insight. But there's also the specific immediacy of our relationship to God, which Lonergan thematizes using Romans 5:5, the love of God poured into our hearts by the gift of the Holy Spirit. And he doesn't do it in these terms in method, um, but I like to do it in these terms because I find it clarifying. In Insight, he talks about the problem of ethics as being about a problem of willingness, um, that uh, which is to say liberty, right? That which I'm not willing to do, I'm not free to do. And in a certain respect, right, Lonergan, if you know Insight at all, right, Lonergan has an account of biases, um, dramatic bias, which has to do with sort of our psyches, and is a kind of aesthetic form of bias, and a psychological form in the psychoanalytic sense. There's individual bias, which is a kind of centering of me. There's group bias, which has to do with not being willing to admit certain questions and ideas because they might threaten the fellow feeling of a community. There's general bias, which is the general bias in favor of the practicality of common sense against the relative abstruseness of theory. And all of those forms of bias are all forms of cognitive unfreedom. It's an unwillingness to ask certain questions and an unwillingness to admit certain answers, certain ideas. Um, and so what one may find immediately is that, and usually in retrospect, that one is now willing to ask certain questions wasn't willing to ask before. And one is willing to admit answers to those questions one wouldn't accept before. One way of thematizing what supernatural faith is one receives as a gift the willingness to affirm as true things that without the gift of faith you wouldn't affirm as true, like that someone was raised from the dead in first century Palestine, right? Um, and so it can be that one's tacit or operative philosophy is cabined by their relative unfreedom with regard to certain operative philosophical ideas or explicit philosophical ideas, if you like. And it can be that it is downstream of a gift of liberty, of willingness by God's grace, that one is liberated to inhabit a more capacious world because one is willing to um, ask certain philosophical questions and even affirm certain philosophical answers that previously one just couldn't have lived with. Um, okay. Lonergan will, in Method and Theology, will talk about those things in terms of different kinds of conversion. And so the fundamental transformation of willingness is religious conversion.
Mm.
As that then pertains to questions of the good, he calls it moral conversion. And as it pertains to questions of truth and intelligibility, he calls it intellectual conversion. And he says, in the concrete, usually religious conversion comes first. All right. Sorry, long answer, but I hope I got all the things you put on the table there.
Yeah, you nailed it. Thank you. The religious conversion is kind of for him becomes the explicit fifth level of his cognitional model. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean that gets complicated. Jeremy Blackwood wrote a dissertation that's now a book from Marquette University Press on this question, tracing out him talking about this in terms of a fifth level. Um, we talked about this last time, I think, a little bit in terms of the distinction between the intersubjective and the interpersonal. Um,
Right.
and the fifth level is meant to be a mode of self-presence that sort of let me use his technical language, and then you can ask me if you need me to unpack it. Um, the fifth level is existential consciousness sublated by interpersonal commitment. So the way I always thematize this is when one falls in love, we might imagine somebody who says to their beloved, "Baby, for you, anything." Right? And so my willingness is dilated, but it's not just dilated in a vacuum, right? It's dilated in a way that's ordered to the other. And so that, there might, so you have kids and you fall in love with this little thing, and you're so in love that you're willing to like touch weird baby poop. Because like, which is a thing that before you had the kids, you'd be like, get that shit away from me. Right. And now you're like, yeah, whatever.
They
Right.
puke on you, all kinds of
Yeah.
stuff.
Well, when Oscar was baptized, we're standing at the back of the cathedral, and he's my friend Jacob made him a little Benedictine monk's habit for a baptismal gown, and it's all white, and I'm wearing a white shirt and a coat and a tie, and I'm
I see
holding
where
him
this is
like,
going.
and I'm holding him like this in front of me, and I lean him forward, and there's just green baby crap, poop exploded all up the front of me and up the back of him, and we're about to process in at the beginning of the mass. So I was stuck with green baby poop shirt, but my sister-in-law took him and cleaned him up. But yeah,
We
Oscar
need
for
to
you,
think.
anything.
We got to rethink the white garment for infant baptism. Like.
Asking for trouble.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good. Other questions?
I was wondering if you could maybe talk about his distinction between questions of intelligence and questions of reflection, because
Good.
that seems really crucial for grasping what he sees as the difference between Origen and Athanasius's approach to theology.
Yeah, good. You put your finger on it. Um, that's an insightful. You've picked up on an important thing. That really is the crux of the issue. Um, so um, like my kid just biffed in the other room. Let's see, how does she do? Give me 1 second. Let me go make sure that there's no blood.
Uh, Michael, is there a page number you're thinking of? I can bring this up.
Yeah, I think it's page 211, thereabouts.
Okay, there's Sturm and Drang, but no blood, so we're okay. Okay, good. So, the you know the okay, so the overall problematic has to do with these things, these very basic kind of, questions, catechetical questions that emerge about, okay, well, look, um, the Christian teaching about the relationship between the divine persons and the Trinity is an affirmation of similarity and an affirmation of difference. And so, what's the principle of similarity? Um, the problem really is like once you get homoousios on board, if the principle of similarity is being, um, well, then what principle of difference could there possibly be? This is the thing I do with my students all the time, right? We trace um, the sort of Nicene development of the affirmation of homoousios, and I say, well, look, if they're the same being, the same essence, the same nature, why is the Father and not the Son, and why is the Son and not the Father? How could you possibly distinguish them? Um, and that's a really hard question, and so they basically always fail to answer it. But that's part of the thing is I want them to get how hard this problem is. Um, and Tertullian is trying to answer it at really at what if you want to do it really in Lonergan terms, you would call it the level of experience. Or as Lonergan used to sometimes say, at the level of what you can put your paw on. And so there must be some kind, what makes something real is its bodiliness. And so there must be some way in which the son is either sort of in some heavenly way spatially extruded from the father, or in some temporal way subsequent to the father. Right. That's and because that's the way in which bodies are different from each other. They're different from each other either in space or in time or both. Um, Now in Origin, he's going to identify a more sophisticated position, which says, well, the difference is at the level of understanding, right? At the level of intelligibilities as answers to a kind of what is it question. And so, how are you going to establish what the relationship is between the father and the son? Well, it's going to have to be the relationship where, one of them is generative of an idea, and the other is receptive of the idea, or one of them is instantiating the divine idea, and the other is participating in it. Right? Origin uses a number of different kind of Middle Platonist techniques to try and do this. Um, and though the field of origin interpretation is a robust and internally diverse one, Lonergan's position here is basically what you're going to run into is you're going to run into some kind of subordinationism, um, because it can't really be that there that there can be a difference between the father and the son if all you have are the relationships between ideas understood as contents of a direct active insight in answer to the question, sort of, what is it? Now, but Lonergan says, but in the human mind and in the world mediated by meaning, right, there's not just questions for understanding, right, questions about kind of intelligible contents, but there's also questions about there are questions about matters of uh, matters of fact, of actuality, of existence. And those questions are not answered by definitions. Those questions are answered by affirmations or negations. Um, and so he finds in Athanasius, and specifically in Athanasius' sort of rule of interpretation, that everything you would say about the Father, you would say about the Son, except that the Son is not the Father, and vice versa. Um, at least tacitly or implicitly um, makes identifying the difference of the Father and the Son not a matter of answering a what is it question, which would pertain to nature, but a matter of answering a question for reflection. So when you ask the question, is the Son the Father? There are two intelligible answers, right? Yes or no. And if you say that the answer to is the Son the Father, the answer is no, and someone asks you to explain, it's a little bit difficult, or it's maybe frustrating even, because the only exposition you can give is, well, no, the Son is the Son, which is to say the Son is identical with himself, and the Father is identical with himself. Um, and the reason that the Son is the Son and not the Father, and the Father is the Father and not the Son, is because uh, that's their identity. That's that is they're them and not. And do you hear I'm stumbling because for questions of reflection, you have these kind of punctiliar dichotomous responses that are available, right? For is it questions, you get yes or you get no. You either affirm that they're identical with themselves or they're not. Um, and so having a distinction in your cognitional theory, right, in your theory of what sort of mind does, between understanding ideas and reflective questions that issue in yeses or nos, right, in affirmations or negations, allows you to be able to say that as to what they are, the Father and the Son are homoousios, are the same. But as to their identity, they're distinct. Now Thomas will develop this in terms of relations of procession and stuff, but we're stopping at about the fifth century here, so we don't have to go on to deal with that. Um, but that ends up being the ground of Thomas's position on um, the divine relations, is that the things that are related are identities, and they're known that they're grasped in affirmations, um, in reflective kinds of insights rather than what Lonergan will call direct insights. That that's a tough one. That's a tough one in part because uh, Lonergan's point is that, as Lonergan talks about self-appropriation. That's a distinction that I can try to express formally to you. But for it to have a content, you kind of have to be familiar with the data on the distinction in your own mind. Um, so I don't know. Is that intelligible? Is that helpful at all, or have I made it worse?
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I think the confusion that I was maybe having was a couple weeks ago in the triune God systematics, right? Like he talks a lot about like the distinction between like Aristotle's first and second operations of the intellect,
Hmm.
and like the difference between questions of certitude, like what is a thing, and questions of causes. And I
Yeah,
think I was mapping the distinction between intelligence and reflection onto that.
yeah,
But I think reflection is like it's literally just like a yes or a no, just like an affirmation or
yeah.
a negation, right?
And it grasps it like in analogous to the way that direct insight grasps the unity of form, um, the reflective insight grasps the unity of identity. And so, right, this coffee mug, the worst cliched philosophy professor examples, excuse me. But this coffee cup is formally one with every other coffee mug, right? Because they're the same kind. They're the same species of thing. Um, but only this coffee mug is identical with itself, right? Um, and so, right, if I ask what is this, you can say coffee mug and put it in a class with every other coffee mug, right? Um, but if you ask me like, is he holding a coffee cup? The answer is yes or no, right?
Sure.
And this is where for Lonergan, this is where this is the term of knowledge of the cognitional process is knowledge of being, right? It's about an affirmation of being, of what is. Um, okay, good. I don't know. Anybody want to follow up on that? This is both really essential and also um, uh, I came to figuring this stuff out kind of late, so I'm sensitive to the fact that it's kind of difficult.
I have a question that I think is related. If it's not, just say save it. But on 213, he's describing um like Socrates and Aristotle and how uh Socrates is annoying people in because they're not able to define to answer his questions. But then Lonergan saying that in Nicomachean Ethics, he's finally then able to offer definitions. So it's been too long since I've read any of that, but is like in Nicomachean Ethics, he's sort of saying like courage is the midway point between foolhardiness and cowardice. And so
Yeah.
like offering clear kind of frames of reference. But then in the Socratic dialogues, there's like these practical application questions that he
Mhm.
twists people into knots about. Is that an accurate understanding? And does that
Yeah, here, let me look at this. This is another page where that's really quite central to what he's doing here. Um, it's a little easier for me to read in my PDF, so I'll look at it here and I'll trust Paul to scroll with us. Um, let's actually start at the bottom of 212 because that'll help us. Um, Oh, actually, no. Top of 213 is fine. We don't have to set it all up. All right. Um, Augustine was a thinker of considerable acumen. The Western Church was long familiar with the Trinity, yet Augustine employed a purely heuristic device to say what was meant by person. I've totally stolen this when I teach the Trinity. What, he asked, are there three of in the Trinity? Well, Father, Son, and Spirit are three. But there are not three gods, nor three fathers, nor three sons. What then are there three of? It is to have an answer to this question that one says there are three persons. So you can have a kind of a very thin heuristic, I would say kind of catechetical understanding of the Trinity, um, where you just say, what are divine persons? What there's three of in God, right? And if somebody says, well, what are those? You go, um, well, two of them are sent on missions to the world, and one of them proceeds from, you know, one other person, and one of them, if you're in the West, Latin West, proceeds from two of the other persons. You can give some determinations. Lonergan goes on. Such a notion of a person is, of course, merely heuristic. It puts a question, but it does not supply a determinate answer. But there was an earlier experience of the state of affairs when Socrates asked for definitions. All and only, omni et soli, of fortitude, temperance, justice, and truth. While no Athenian could afford to admit that he did not know what the words meant, it also was true that none, not even Socrates, could produce the desired definitions. Indeed, definitions of the virtues and the vices were not forthcoming until Aristotle wrote his Nicomachean Ethics, and that writing involved the enormous shift from the common sense Socratic viewpoint, right? Which is to say, all right, hey, y'all are, we're in the Agora and people are talking. I love the beginning of the Republic, um, right? They go to Cephalus's house, and Socrates sort of says, hey, Cephalus, you're a successful old guy. Tell us what's nice about being a successful old guy. And he talks about a couple things, and one of the things he says is, and you've got enough money together that you can make sacrifices, so you don't spend a bunch of time in Hades for your injustices. And Socrates goes, "Huh, interesting." And then I always imagine Socrates as like a really close talker and getting right up to Cephalus and just being like, "You said justice. What's justice?" Right? And Cephalus gives like an utterly boring answer. And Lonergan goes, well, I'm not so sure about, or not Lonergan, Socrates goes, I'm not so sure about that. And, the impetuous son jumps in and gives like the good Homeric answer. You help your friends and you hurt your enemies. That's justice, obviously. And then we spend pages tearing that apart. Um, so what you have is the kind of operative cultural common sense notions walking around. And what Socrates does is show their inadequacy um, to the kind of, really, for him, the model is mathematics, right? The kind of ideal of um, control of definitions that it happens in mathematics. But like, a lot of the dialogues end in aporia. He just, book one famously ends in aporia about what justice is. And Lonergan thinks that what you get in the Nicomachean Ethics and the other Aristotelian texts is a new technique, right? And the technique is an elaborate systematic viewpoint where the terms are defined in via their relationship to one another, right? So what's courage? Well, courage is the mean between cowardice and rashness, right? Um, or, what's a soul? Well, a soul is that thing that makes living bodies different from dead bodies. Yeah, but what is it? Uh, well, it's whatever that thing is that, right? It's also heuristic. So Lonergan's saying like, yeah, on the one hand, it's merely heuristic, but also um, notice how much more of a reliable definition Aristotle's definition of the soul is than like all the stuff the atomistic definitions of soul and stuff he considers in the first book of the De Anima. Um, Now, if one follows the lead of Augustine and profits by the experience of Socrates and the analyst, then one will explain the meaning of nature, person, and hypostasis in the decree of Chalcedon by saying that nature means what there are two of in Christ, while person or hypostasis means what there is one of in Christ. Nor is there doubt about what is the one and what are the two, right? You get this kind of really beautiful, pristine clarity, um, right? Which is part of why I teach it so minimalistically when I teach the Trinity. Because then my students can go on to speak in a way that doesn't break the kind of logic of the creeds if they can hang on to like what is divine nature? It's what there's one of in God. What are divine persons? What there's three of in God, right? How many natures are there in the hypostatic union? Two. How many persons? One. Um, so, um, and then so Lonergan goes on 214, top of 214. Actually, no. Jump. So I'm going to skip the thing about sort of nominalism because he's going to make something out of this to what we were talking about before, right? That when it keeps saying one and the same Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, that really is important for the sort of judgment of identity. But I want to jump down to the third paragraph. Such a mode of exposition is, of course, minimal, and it is. It's minimal. It's not intended to prevent the work of the historical theologian from investigating the use of terms in previous, contemporary, or subsequent writers. It's not intended to replace the work of the systematic theologian who compares the various interpretations and theories that have been propounded and determines where his own preferences lie. But I believe a minimal interpretation, however tautologous, nonetheless has a real utility. It is easily grasped and easily accepted. It accords with the canonical and no less theological principle that what has not been evidently defined has not been defined at all. It provides a guideline in one's estimate of the dogmatic significance of subsequent definitions of the person and metaphysical, psychological, phenomenological, existential, and personalist theories of the person. Right? So um, you're going to get a kind of control out of this that prevents things from just being interminably squishy and confused. Um, and so that's part of what he's doing with this, right? Is he's saying, um, in much as in the development of Greek philosophy, you have Socrates interrogating the various rhetorical gambits of people trying to describe what courage means in the Athenian community or what justice means in the Athenian community de facto. And he's trying to de jure get an account of what justice or courage is in itself, but he's not quite able to make the pivot from the concrete, um, sort of multivalent communicative context of a living community into the rarefied air of a theory of the case. And he thinks Aristotle makes an advance on Socrates slash Plato insofar as he lights on this idea of having a heuristic control of terms where the meaning of the terms is fixed by their relationship to each other. And yes, it's minimal, and yes, it's heuristic. And if you confuse it for a substantive account, it will seem tautologous. But nevertheless, it gives you a kind of control that allows you to then go on and make headway on more substantive investigations without things just getting messy and squishy and confused. Now, I've talked all that time, and as usual, I'm a little worried that I wandered from your question. So, Pat, did I get at what you were asking about?
Yeah, you helpfully clarified what
Okay.
was going on in Greek philosophy. And is it also the case that, and I think you maybe said this or hinted at it, just from my own understanding, is the progression in Greek philosophy analogous to the progression from Origin to Athanasius, or
Oh,
or are these of a different kind?
yeah. That's a good question. No, I don't think Lonergan intends it to be analogous. I think he's just drawing an analogy between Augustine's heuristic procedure and the movement from Athenian common sense through Socrates to Aristotle. I think that's the only analogy that's intended. We've left Origin and or Tertullian and Origin and Athanasius behind, and we've shown the way in which Augustine is able to sort of make hay out of Athanasius's little breakthrough to how person is predicated on the basis of an affirmation of identity. Yeah,
Okay, that's helpful. Thank
good.
you.
Thanks. No, that's a good question though. I hadn't noticed that before, but that's yeah, he's moving on. He's set up a platform and now he's standing on that platform and he's doing a new thing.
Hmm.
Like I said, he's wedged just a pile of stuff in here. Um, I mean, I could very well teach a semester long course just taking pieces out of this and spending a week on each of them easily. All right. Other questions?
So actually, I have a question relating to the text that starts in the very next section that's on the screen already,
Oh,
conveniently
great.
enough. I also want to say I appreciate the previous clarification because charity led me to not realize that he was endorsing Aristotle's approach.
Oh,
So I actually mistook his meaning. So yeah. In any case, my question is, so he has the opening part here where he talks about the language of the of Constantinople.
Mhm.
But then what interests me is actually the declaration he makes about it on the top of the next page, where he says the significance of this variant is that it makes it very explicit that the one person in Christ is a divine person.
Yep.
And okay, so but he's evading defining a person in any way. And what makes him so certain that this one person is Christ is divine, or that there is, or and what is he grounding the distinction between a divine person and a human person?
Yeah, good. Um, Now there are two answers to your question. And one of them is more satisfying. Well, who knows? They might be equally unsatisfying, but one of them is less intellectual than the other. I mean, one reason is he's making that affirmation is that's what Denzinger says, right? Like that's what the um, codified doctrine of the Catholic Church is, and it's still true. I mean, right? God loved Jordan Wood, but he got me dragged for about 4 days on Twitter because I mentioned that uh, I was teaching RCIA, and somebody asked a question, and I broached the fact that in Catholic teaching, Christ is a divine person and not a human person. And as you can imagine, that it offended Jordan's sensibilities, and a small army of like-minded theologians, yeah, dragged me. Uh, and and I was annoyed at the time because I'm like, dude, I'm just telling these RCA students what it says in the catechism. I don't know what you want from me. Now maybe I don't need to go there, but like, someone has to question. Um, so that's one reason, right? Is that like as much as we've talked about before, Lonergan is a kind of in matters philosophical, quite a
It,
forward-looking.
it, it doesn't actually the warrant he gives though. It doesn't actually follow from that language that that's the case though.
No,
You
I'm
know what
just
I mean?
telling you, just
Okay, okay,
as a matter
okay,
of biography, like that's what's going on.
okay.
Is that he says in Method and Theology, like when it comes to doctrine and dogma, I'm a conservative theologian.
Right.
So there are some ways in which what he says about like there are just some affirmations that theologians make because like that's what like the ordinary magisterium of the Catholic Church teaches. And it's just above your pay grade to like argue with it. So that's just as a biographical matter, that's one piece. Um, let's get into, as you were asking though, you're asking about the internal logic of it, which is a horse of a different color, as it says in The Wizard of Oz. Um, okay, so the Third Council of Constantinople in 681. So we're well past the fifth century now. Added to Chalcedon's affirmations of two natures in Christ, the further affirmation of two wills and two operations. Naturally enough, it placed before its own decree a repetition with variants of the decree of Chalcedon. One of the variants that has been thought significant is as follows: where at Chalcedon the subject of the statement, excuse me, where at Chalcedon the subject of the statement is the Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. At Constantinople 3, the subject is our Lord Jesus Christ, our true God, one of the holy, consubstantial, life-giving Trinity. Um, the significance of this variant is that it makes very explicit that the one person in Christ is a divine person. It follows that there is not a human person in Christ. This conclusion was acceptable enough as long as theologians confine their thought on the person to metaphysical definitions and theories. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind is where he's gonna go um, criticizing um, Schoenberg and these other Dutch theologians who are doing revisionist Christologies. Um, but their revisionist Christologies run the opposite direction, for example, of Jordan's. where they're gonna want to say for psychological, anthropological, and philosophical and sort of philosophical anthropological reasons um, that the incarnation sort of can't do its pastoral work if Jesus isn't, in addition to being a divine person, also a human person. Where really what they mean is like, what are there, what is there two of in the Chalcedonian affirmation? Well, there's two natures and there's two persons, a human person and a divine person, right? They're gonna deny and get dinged by the I don't know what it's called now, but it used to be called the CDF, uh, by the Curia for saying something heterodox, right? So it is important to remember that like Lonergan's worried about things shifting in this other direction. And basically he's saying is that like there's an equivocation about what's meant by person between these Dutch theologians and the development of the notion of person that passes through Tertullian, Origen, Athanasius, and then Augustine, and then ultimately for him unto Aquinas. Um, the Now the reason he's going to draw this inference that the one person in Christ is a divine person and not a human person has to do with where is it? He says it somewhere else. He doesn't drop it right here. Um, this thing after he walks us through. I have to be honest. I find him walking through the debate between um, Cyril and Nestorius really tedious. Um, Maybe somebody else found it really lively, but I found it a little bit. Every time I read this, I'm like, yeah, 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 come on, let's go. Um, this bit at the bottom of 218. Uh, where he's going to say, he's going to say, can anything be done to meet the current need for clarification, right? He thinks the Dutch theologians are confusing things, but he also understands why it's happening, right? Why there's this ambiguity. He says, well, one thing I've already done is to overcome the ambiguity of realism. But then these two paragraphs are more germane to your question. A second step would be to distinguish three meanings of the word one. And I think this may get more to what you're asking about.
Yeah.
The first of these meanings is associated with experiential activity. It is one more, the numerical one, in the sense that one is one more than zero, two is more than one, and so on. The second meaning of one is associated with understanding. Understanding grasps the functional unity of the parts of a machine, the functional organic unity of a living thing, the developmental unity of a person's life. Now, he hadn't read Jordan's book, so he wouldn't have known to add this. But something I would have added here that he implies earlier is, um, and that I talked about earlier, is the unity grasped by the apprehension of form. Um, which is still an intellectual unity. Um, it's the unity that Origen's on about. The third meaning of one is associated with judgment. It is one in the sense of identity. To affirm implies negations. That right there is why he draws the negative inference from the affirmation of identity.
Right.
Jones is all that Jones is, but he is not somebody else or all that somebody else is. He is himself and just himself. And so then we can go to the third step. A third step would be to state the conditions of the possibility of the incarnation. A first condition would be that the Father, Son, and Spirit be identities in the positive sense, each is himself. A second condition would be that they be identities in the restrictive sense with regard to one another. The Father is not the Son, the Father is not the Spirit, the Son is not the Spirit, etc. A third condition would be that the Son need not be an identity in the restrictive sense with regard to some rational creature. The Son can become a human being. A fourth condition is that a human being may have his identity not in himself, but in another. To affirm the possibility of the incarnation is to affirm that these conditions have been fulfilled. To affirm the incarnation as a fact is to say that these conditions, can have been fulfilled. To affirm the incarnation as a fact is to say that these conditions have been fulfilled. To say what the incarnation means is to explain the conditions of its possibility. Okay, so um, here you're getting, and here the two reasons converge on each other. The biographical reason I mentioned before and his own philosophical reasons converge, um, which is uh, on the one hand, you have this notion of the apprehension of a unit, the unity of judgment, not just the unity of insight, um, which is an affirmation that applies negations. And then you have added to that a dogmatic definition of the incarnation, which says that it is that the unity of identity is a divine identity that is incarnate by the assumption of a human nature. And so, anyway, that's where the lines converge for him here. Now, on the one hand, I think um, probably Lonergan would have criticized um, Jordan's account of hypostatic identity as being idealist and probably akin to Origin.
Mm-hmm.
To which I think Jordan would probably say, I should ask him this. I've never put this to him directly. I think he would say, yeah, exactly. Um, he's no problem identifying as an idealist in those ways. Um,
Yes.
and uh, and then I think he would. And I was going to say a second thing, and it just left my head. Um, he would say that. No, and something else which I forget. Maybe it'll come to me. On the other hand, um, one of the things that is an ambiguity that doesn't get sorted out here is um, is uh, if person really has as its content the unity grasped in a judgment, not in an insight, and it's just an affirmation of identity. Um, are there intrinsic philosophical speculative reasons to put an adjective on it, like divine or human for that matter?
Mhm.
Or is the only reason you would do that because of the authority, the sort of authority of the dogmatic context, right?
Right.
That the reason you put it on there is because that's the teaching that as a systematician you're trying to shed light on, right? And so you receive it, like Thomas says, right? You're a subordinate discipline, and you receive your first principles from somewhere else, and the somewhere else is the magisterial teaching of the church. Um, that Lonergan, it doesn't seem to me, at least here, that Lonergan has an answer to that. And there, I think Jordan has a really good question for Lonergan um, about, okay, okay, Lonergan, like, is this heuristic judgment-based affirmation of identity, um, is it really enough to fully explain this doctrinal affirmation in the way that you're picking it up? So is that, I don't know, is that too sort of on the one hand, but on the other hand?
That's good. That's good. And I think I was understanding him properly and following.
Yeah.
I really wished he had. So if I were to try to reinforce his point from my perspective,
Lonergan's?
I actually would have wanted to get into at least attempting to set some parameters for what we mean in orientation, or excuse me, what we mean by person. And I would have to say that, like, it's a relational orientation.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking of personhood as a relational orientation, then I think there's a genuine you can genuinely distinguish between a human, or at least a fallen human, and a divine
Yeah.
orientation, right? So
Yep.
that's a real distinction.
And
But
and and in the when he's doing Thomist Trinitarian theology, he can do that.
right,
But if you're just in the seventh century,
gotcha. So context prevents him from
it's just not on
bolstering
the table here.
his point here. I'm not.
But
Yeah,
in the Thomist Trinitarian theory, it isn't just the judgment of identity isn't just a matter of affirmation. It's, as you said, also a matter of relation. And so,
right,
why is the Son the Son? Well, the Son is the person who proceeds from the Father, and only the Father.
right, right,
Again, Latin West. If you don't affirm the oh, the word just escaped me. If you only say that the Spirit, proceeds from the Father, you can't do this. But
right,
if you're in the Latin West, you can say, all right, the Father is the divine person from whom the Son and the Spirit proceed. The Son is the one who proceeds from the Father, and the Spirit is the one that proceeds from the Father and the Son. And so the differences of relation fix the identity. And so then you actually have a reason to say, like, why is the Son a divine person? Well, because like he's the only person of any persons who proceeds from the Father.
Well, I think yeah, and it's implicit in one of those like on from page like toward the end there from when he was talking about like having the identity in another. Like
Hmm.
that's the difference is right there. Like
Hmm.
that's where the difference is
Yeah.
because what is characteristic of human identity in the fallen state is to absolutely not have the identity
Right.
anywhere but in the self.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Or anyway, or even if you want to do a kind of analogy, a kind of theological analogy of human personhood as being relational in the same way, um, it's still per accidens, right? Um, and so it might be constitutive in certain ways, but it like definitely could be otherwise. Um, anyway, but yeah, good. No, it's
Yeah,
a good question, and yeah, I do think that I do, it is like it is one of those things that I do think, in the seventh century, you just don't have enough of the pieces on the board um, to really deal with that question.
gotcha.
Yeah,
All right.
good question. Thank you. Other questions? I don't know. Well, I have no idea how much time has gone by. I got to rambling here. Okay, we have another hour or so. Good.
It's not really related to the text, but out of
Great.
curiosity, when you're talking to your students in 2025 and you're going through this heuristic tool that we've used theologically
Mhm.
about Father is, you can say of the Father with Son, the Son, et cetera, et cetera. How do they respond? Do they take that? Do they run with it? Do they like it? Do they find it satisfying, unsatisfying? I mean,
Yeah. Um, I like to think they mostly feel resentment. Uh,
you're doing your job.
no, I don't know. I think when I teach it to them, I take it all the way. I bring in Thomas on mission and processions as well, and so it becomes if I just did uh if I just did Nicaea and Chalcedon, and then I gave a kind of model of the Trinity as three persons and one nature, and the hypostatic union is two natures in one person. Uh, that falls pretty flat because they're kind of like, I mean, I get how they sort of like, I get how they got to asking these questions, but also like, once you have the answer to the questions, who cares? Um, but when I bring in, okay, you have this picture of God where God is, um, a community of eternally loving persons, and Christianity is this encounter with two of those persons sent by the third in love in the missions of the Spirit and the Son, that filling those pieces in, even though I think most people will be like, oh my gosh, it's intro to Catholicism, you're teaching the missions and processions, like, are you insane? But I do think adding those pieces helps give them a kind of scaffold to hang the economy of salvation on. That is like, okay, Christian, like that's much more in line with, I think, how they're able to appreciate, uh, honestly, not just non-Western, but just non-Christian religions in like a world religion class. They're often able, because you get this like 35,000 foot view and it's like Religion of the Week club. Often you're actually able to get a really nice kind of big picture view of like, here's why people are into this, right? Because it gives you, what was is it Peter Berger who does the sacred canopy thing? Is that Peter Berger? Yeah. Right. It gives you some sense of like, oh, this is a sacred canopy that you can live a life under. And I think being able to give a picture of the divine as an interpersonal, an eternal interpersonal community of love that is reaching out interpersonally into human history um, through these missions. Uh, I think that helps people get a sense of what the sacred canopy of Christianity is. Um, and some of them are able to be like, oh, okay, that like helps me get that 30,000 foot, Mercator projection view of things. And other people are just like, for a lot of students, it's an affliction.
Got it.
Um, for a lot of students, it's just like, this is confusing and hard. Leave me alone. I thought this was going to be th Sunday school, and the answer was going to be Jesus. Like, what has a fluffy tail and hides nuts for the winter? And
Yeah,
Jesus, I assume, because it's Christianity class.
thanks.
Yeah. Other questions?
Could we go back to the beginning just quickly, where he like sketches out what he's calling naive realism and then like goes through idealism and then offers critical
Yeah.
realism as like sort of the corrective?
Yeah.
And I think I understood it, but I would love to hear you just give a summary about like what is the misunderstanding in Kant, for example, that has us think we're stuck in the merely phenomenal world? Like,
Yeah.
help me get out of the merely phenomenal world.
Yeah, good. So uh so the naive realism part is relatively clear, right? Um it's uh you know, if it's real, I can go over and I can put my paw on it. In the Insight, he uses the example of a kitten, and a saucer of milk is real if he can drink it. And if it's a hyper realistic photo or something that draws the kitten up to it, but then it can't put its snoot in there and drink, that ain't real. Um, and so naive realism, Lonergan thinks, is part of the reason naive realism predominates is because actually we spend so much more. There's an essay called "The Dimensions of Meaning," which I think we're going to read later, where he very quickly says, "Look, we spend a whole big stretch of our life operating according to this kind of animal criterion of reality." And it's really important for our survival. It's really important for us getting around in the world. Um, we get really good facility with it really fast. And then we come to the age of reason and we have to be inducted into this much bigger world, uh, this much larger reality that's mediated by meaning. Uh, and it's just hard. We've become habituated to this sort of animal criterion, and it's hard to onboard a further criterion which is not especially visceral. It's not implicated in our survival. Um, and it requires a certain amount of subtlety about really what concretely we do when we live in a world mediated by meaning. Much like Piaget highlighted the subtleties of, what the human organism does as it develops from infancy, right? We have these abbreviated objectifications that are abbreviated precisely because it's so familiar. We kind of glide over all the little minutia of the particular developments. Okay, so then when one, if one gets a philosophical itch and one is able to objectify, to thematize the criterion, this animal criterion of reality, that reality is what you can go and sense and confront with your body. Well then, Hume is amazing because Hume is like causation. What are you talking about? There's sequence, but like what color is the causation? Right? How many decibels is the causation? No such thing. Um, and then, Kant famously is awoken from his dogmatic slumbers by Hume, right? He takes this as a really critical challenge. And so in Kant, and look, this is sort of flat-footed Kant. You'll have to forgive me. But certainly, the Kant of the first critique, um, Kant was a genius. It really, like, if you climb in Kant's sandbox and you let him set the rules and the parameters, he very infrequently makes mistakes. But there are certain uh, implicit assumptions. Sometimes they're explicit, but often they're kind of implicit assumptions in Kant. Um, and one of them is that, well, where does one make contact with the noumenal for Kant? And even that way of forming the question includes the assumption, right? Well, where you have immediacy is in sense intuition. Um, but sense intuition isn't knowledge of objects. It's disorganized. And in fact, actually, there's the empirical a priori of space and time. I love Kant's example here is wonderful. Kant says, okay, imagine a space with no objects in it. Now, imagine an object but no space, right? And your imagination like goes blue screen of death because you just can't do it. And so he goes, well, then space must be an a priori condition of sense intuition, right? You must be bringing space to the party. Um, and so then he'll say that um, so then knowledge of objects is this kind of categorization and conceptual organizing of the immediacy of experience by the understanding. Um, and Heidegger will object to this, right? He'll talk about it in terms of ontological violence, because you just like concepts are these kind of cookie cutters that stamp onto the immediacy of sense intuition. Um, and the schematism in the first critique is kind of a fudge. He rewrites it a couple times because everyone's like, I don't know, man, you're making imagination kind of the whole ball game here. And there's neo-Kantians in the 20th century who'll be like, actually, the imagination is the whole ball game. Um, but what's running underneath is this same tacit assumption that one encounters the really real in a kind of immediate confrontation. Um, and the immediate confrontation is sense intuition. The one of the things the idealists are then able to do is to sort of recognize what this affects in philosophical inquiry, which is, well, look, if the immediacy of sense intuition doesn't provide anything in terms of cognition of objects except this like limit case of it puts the coin in the machine, then it's not philosophically interesting, right? And the thing to investigate is the understanding, because that's where the whole ball game is in the understanding. And they're very skeptical of Kant, right? Kant, it is kind of interesting that your list of the categories of the human mind really resembles Aristotle's list of categories. Like, did you notice that? Like, is there really a transcendental analytic going on here, or did you just port this over? Um, and so you're kind of off to the ball game, insofar as the thing that becomes philosophically interesting is the constitution and transformation of ideas. And so you get Fichte, Schelling, Hegel. Um, in the American scene, you get Josiah Royce is an interesting American Hegelian from the end of the 19th century, contemporary of Peirce. Um, Lonergan has a line. He talks about idealism as the halfway house between naive realism and critical realism. Uh, and in some ways, maybe Lonergan is not could be analogized to Wittgenstein in this respect, where Lonergan's going to say, like, look, um, meanings, ideas, the idealists get that they have a kind of reality of their own. Um, but at that point, like, on the one hand, either you can explore, uh, you can say, well, in that case, then all ideas are have truth in some regard, right? This seems to me the kind of fundamental idea behind Hegel is that you have to in the um, whether you do it in the sort of circular way in the logic or the sort of trajectory way of the phenomenology, um, right? You're exploring in the dialectic all the different respects in which all of the ideas have truth, right? Um, well, or you can say um, that there's a principle that distinguishes uh, ideas that are true from ideas that are false, um, in the world mediated by meaning. And now you're a critical realist, which is to say that yeah, there's the real of animal extroversion, of sensitive, intuitive immediacy, but there's another criterion of the real, which is that which is intelligently conceived, not just intelligently conceived, but also rationally affirmed. Um, right? Not just and so the where Lonergan would distinguish himself, for example, from Hegel, would be in that second piece that right. It's we're not just interested in everything that has been and can be intelligently conceived, but also dialectically in sifting out um, those ideas which are intelligently conceived from those ideas and can be rationally affirmed from those ideas which cannot be rationally affirmed. And Lonergan thinks when you have a true judgment, you know the real. And so he's not an idealist, and in that regard, he's not an idealist. Um, he's a realist, but he's a realist where the criterion is rational affirmation, not intuitive immediacy. Um, and so he's actually similar to Peirce in that regard. Peirce is similar in that Peirce's earliest articles are critiques of the faculty of intuition. He makes a pretty good argument that there's just no such thing. Um, but Peirce doesn't have the criterion of how would you make a rational affirmation or negation. And so for Peirce, being is known in the infinite long run by the entire community of inquirers. And Lonergan thinks, no, you know stuff all the time. Um, you come to judgments where you discern the true from the false, and you just have to notice that it's happening, and then be able to discern, why is that knowledge? So Lonergan asks three questions, which he lists here. What am I doing when I'm knowing? Right? I need an adequate objectification of the procedures that happen when I know things. I need a critical account of why doing that is knowing. That's epistemology. Um, and then, it would be helpful to derive from that a theory of what is known by doing that set of activities, and that's metaphysics. So cognitional theory, what am I doing when I'm knowing? Epistemology, why is doing that knowing? Metaphysics, What do I know when I do that? Okay. We want to do any falls? That was like blitz through so many years of philosophical history, but um,
Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you.
okay, good. But so let me just reiterate one point there that just in case it wasn't clear. Lonergan thinks that the empiricist and the idealist, or the naive realist and the idealist, share a criterion of reality. Right? They share this um, intuitionist criterion of confrontational immediacy. That's what makes things real. Yeah. If people are interested in the connection between a much more detailed and subtle exploration of the relationship between Lonergan and Hegel, a philosopher at Loyola Marymount who's retired in the past 10 years or 5 years, named Mark Morelli, has a number of books exploring the connection. His most recent one is called, I think it's called Hegel Inside Out or something like that. Um, but he gets into this stuff in much greater detail than I can. But
To me, that comes across as a fundamental denial of mysticism.
tell me what you,
If you deny that there is such a thing as intuition, you're fundamentally denying the mystical experience.
oh, Lonergan doesn't deny intuition. Peirce does.
Okay,
Uh, Lonergan think I mean insight is intellectual intuition.
right.
What he denies is that the immediate intuitive immediacy is the criterion of knowledge of reality. Um, now,
Gotcha.
and so actually,
No, it's the
yeah,
experience. It's the experience, but not the knowledge. Knowledge
right,
comes after the experience.
right, yeah,
Yeah. Okay. I didn't agree with that.
yeah, yeah. It would Peirce on mysticism is an interesting question. I'm sure that's a dissertation that's been written, but I don't know about it if it does. Yeah. Peirce, it's a trip to read Peirce's first couple of essays, his first couple of publications, because uh, the boogeyman in it is nominalism, and you're like, I'm sorry, is it like 1869 and you're writing essays where nominalism is the bad guy? You're like writing them in Cambridge in Massachusetts, and you're attacked. Like, what is going on?
I actually have a Russian. Well, he's not Russian. He's an American who lives in Russia. But I have an American friend who lives in Russia, who is a Peirce scholar.
Oh yeah,
So yeah.
I find Peirce endlessly fascinating. I like him way better than James or Dewey, uh, but yeah, there's some idiosyncrasies there. Good philosopher, not a very nice man, Charles Sanders Peirce. I think he threw a brick at his wife once or something horrible like that. Not a good dude. All right, other questions.
I had a question on page 219 towards the
Okay,
end of the chapter.
sweet.
Um, in the sort of at the top of the last paragraph. So this is in relation to the First Vatican Council, and um, Lonergan writes that in both these writings that he's referring to as previous works, I accepted the statement of Vatican I that what has been both revealed by God and defined by the Church is permanently valid in the sense determined by its own historical context. And I was uh, surprised maybe by the use of the word permanently there.
Yeah.
It felt like
Mhm.
trying to have two things at once, maybe, or like hedge a bet.
Yeah.
Um, could you say something about what's going on in this sentence?
Yeah, good. It's a way of saying that doctrines are abstract. Where abstraction means, among other things, that it's an answer to a question. And so it's possible. Lonergan, as a doctrinal matter and as a speculative matter, thinks that it's possible for the church as a community to ask certain questions and definitively answer them. Um, However, one of the things Lonergan is concerned with is that, well, two things. I mean, here he's obviously concerned with uh, that when you detach doctrines from their relationship to the question that they answer, you detach them from the criterion of their correctness. Right? This is generally true for Lonergan. That if affirmative judgments are affirmations of the correctness of an insight, the criterion of correctness is set by the question the insight answers. Which means actually that you can have that changes in the question will can constitute changes in the criterion of correctness, so that you can have two different answers that sound contradictory to one another, but are in fact both correct because they're both answers to different. They are each answers to different questions, right? They're not answers to identical questions. Um, an interesting example of this might be to look at the joint declaration on justification between the Catholic Church and the Lutheran and the ELCA, right? Where basically what they say is like, we actually agree on this, even though the doctrinal locutions of both churches are verbally opposed to each other. But the reason they're verbally opposed to each other is because like we're really like it's really apples and oranges. Um, and so what you have to do then is a historical reconstruction, and this is what Lonergan tries to do in his De Deo Trino Pars Dogmatica, the doctrines part, the first term textbook for his Trinity course, is he does a kind of an intellectual history reconstruction of the development of Nicene Orthodoxy, um, that tries to situate the various Christological positions relative to the question they're answering, so that you can make judgments about the adequacy of the answers based on the criteria implicitly set out by the question. And so you can have permanent validity, um, insofar as you can have something which definitively answers a particular theological question. But to know, but the qualifier at the end is kind of the whole ball game in its own historical, determined by its own historical context, right? You have
Mhm.
to know what that answer meant in its context, and you really have to know how that answer or how that doctrine answered the questions that were governing the intellectual development in that context.
Right.
Um, and so part of his problem with these Dutch guys is they're wanting to reject uh, these Chalcedonian affirmations on the basis of anachronism, where they seem, on his judgment, to not really be understanding the Chalcedonian affirmations according to the questions and the context that determine their meaning. Right? They're porting in all these contemporary phenomenological, anthropological, and existentialist notions of person, um, that Lonergan thinks just don't. They just don't apply. Now, on the other hand, this has a really interesting implications for enculturation in the Catholic Church, which is that for Lonergan, questions are occasioned by experience, and experience is always spatiotemporally located. And so, and it's interesting in terms of synodality as well, there may be theological questions that arise for the church in the context of African Catholicism or South American Catholicism or East Asian Catholicism. Uh, and those communities, in their effort to answer those questions, analogous to Nicaea and Chalcedon, will engage their culture, adopt and adapt things from their culture to generate answers to these questions. And may even, the bishops in synodal consultation may even determine that um, you know these are the answers that we're going to affirm And these are the answers we're going to anathematize to these questions that have arisen in our experiential context. And then the task for a 21st century church and on, the task becomes for the rest of the church to be able to, not in a historical way, um, come to understand the determining context of the question and the answers that are being affirmed, but in a contemporary but intercultural way, appreciate the context, right? And so, we saw this with all the bullshit about Pachamama and all that stuff, right? That you had people who were like, well, this is right, who have no understanding of the indigenous cultures, have no understanding of the way in which Christianity has been enculturated in these communities, have no understanding of the way in which those communities, just like second, third, fourth, fifth century Christians did with Hellenistic culture, these Catholic communities are doing the same thing with their indigenous cultures. We could say the same thing about Igbo Catholics in Nigeria. I mean, on and on and on, right? It's exactly the same dynamic of cultural engagement to address emergent desires to understand and make sense of the faith and how it's lived. But because people don't understand cross-culturally, right, the questions that set out the criterion of adequacy or the answers that are given and how they engage and not only adopt but also adapt the indigenous cultures, they just go, oh, well, it's just an idol, right? I can't believe they brought an idol to the Vatican, right? And it's it's a mess. And it's just and in so many ways it's just cultural chauvinism. But Lonergan sort of having it both ways in terms of permanent validity, but also that the permanent validity is cabined by the determinations of a particular context allows for this, right? It allows for one both to affirm the validity and the permanence of Nicaea and Chalcedon and Constantinople III and on, but also have a future that's opened to new questions and new answers that can attain new validity um, out into the future, right? We don't have to be sort of doctrinal primitivists um, as Catholics. Anyway, I hope thank you all for indulging that bit of intra-Catholic uh, uh, drama. But yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense, Pat?
It does. Yeah. I would the meaning have changed if you just left the word permanently out? Like it is valid
Yes.
according to the standards of its own context, but permanently valid, like
I
how
think
does
he would say, I think he would, you would have two, I mean, you'd have a pile of problems, right? One problem is that it would be facially relativist, um, right? That things are only true they're true in a way that isn't just conditioned by their context, but in fact is um, isolated to the context or something, right?
Hmm.
Um, I mean, the other problem you would have is like, Vatican One's still on the books, um, and Lonergan's teaching at the Greg, um, or Regis or whatever, So those affirmations of permanent validity, I think, are really important. I think they're also important for, you know. magisterial continuity and things like that. Um, but yeah, I mean, I will say when I read Method and Theology and he makes essentially the same claim in there, and I read it as a Protestant and I wasn't Catholic yet, I was really skeptical. And in fact, I read it with Charles Heffling, who's an Anglican priest and theologian, and he said, "Yeah, I'm not Catholic, so I don't have to agree with him about that." Heffling was just like, "Yeah, I'm not constrained by a magisterium, so I can say I don't buy it."
Hmm.
Bob Doran was pretty convinced of it.
You were
Um,
skeptical about what?
the claim of the permanent validity of dogmatic
Oh,
definition.
got it.
Yeah.
I mean, can we say something like so there's this permanent validity and at the same time the scope of its applicability to present day is not sort of like a one-to-one correspondence.
No. It might be that you have, um, yeah, it might be that you have cultures in which, uh, this is true of our culture. We were talking about my students before, right? I have to spend 2 weeks inducting my students to greater or lesser success into the the horizon of questions in which Nicaea and Chalcedon are meaningful, right? They aren't spontaneously meaningful to them. They just aren't questions that they have. And because they aren't questions they have, the answers are not facially meaningful, right? Their initial reaction is this is incoherent nonsense. I mean, I had two students in my honors class who said that. They just said this doesn't like there's no way this makes any sense. Um, and you know, and it's yeah, you have to you have well, what does Gadamer call it? You have to have a Horizonsverschmelzung, a fusion of horizons, to come to appreciate why these affirmations are meaningful. Um, and
But
so, oh, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. No, no, no,
Yeah.
no. You finish it up.
I was gonna say just I mean all I was gonna say is that yeah, and so then you have you might have doctrinal affirmations which have permanent validity, but that doesn't mean they have like permanent applicability.
Nice.
And what I was going to say is, I mean, if the students, yes, it's good of you to bring your students up to get those questions, but if those questions, which are, I'm presuming are relatively core issues, don't have any relevance or interest to them, whose fault is that? And my answer is not the student's fault, right? I mean, that's a that's a teaching PR, um, teaching slash PR educational issues, which may also bring into question, are they even relevant, right? I mean, are they important anymore? Is it an important thing?
And it gets complicated, right? Because it could be that certain questions lose their liveliness for innocuous reasons, and certain questions can lose their liveliness for pernicious ones. I mean, so let's shift registers. Forgive me for making it political, but here in the United States, right there's a set of concerns that the drafters of the American Constitution had vis-a-vis the state of English monarchy, um, that set mean things get set up in a certain way. And yet the document has a life beyond that. And yeah, it may be that there's certain elements of that that are sort of um, we reinterpret in terms of their applicability because like or like think about like circuit courts, right? They set up courts in a certain way, and the circuit was literally like a guy got on a horse and rode from place to place.
Rosa Circuit, yeah.
Yeah, and so like and so like the logistical apparatus changes, and so you reconceive the sort of grounding of the Article One institution accordingly. Um, but under present conditions, there are certain things which are being reinterpreted in ways that are at odds with the original meaning and context. That, in my private judgment, are really pernicious. And in fact, it's because we've just forgotten we've forgotten how bad it can get when you have you know unchecked autocracy. So.
No,
Um,
that's true.
and so you have to engage. Lonergan has an essay that we're not going to read, but that you can read. Is very short and very good, and but also similarly dense. In a third collection, it's the first essay. It's called "The Dialectic of Authority," um, and you should check it out. "The Dialectic of Authority." It's chapter one in a third collection, where he talks about this. He has an interesting line in there where he talks about the sin of backwardness.
You said that's in a third collection.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was wondering, does his claim for permanence, is it lent credibility through his assertion that his cognitional model is like operative throughout history, whether people are aware of it or not. And
Yep.
so if you're able to recover that history, you can see why
Yeah.
the statements they made are correct. And presumably anyone could recreate that process, right?
Yeah. No, that's right. That you can, if you have familiarity with the normative structure of your own mind, which is one way of talking about what cognitional theory is, right? Is having an objectification of your own apprehension of the normativity of your own mind. Um, I mean, gosh, this is a quite radical claim on Lonergan's part that in the world mediated by meaning, um, the uh, the universal criterion of validity, of authenticity, just like is whether human beings are being attentive, intelligent, reasonable, and responsible. And to know that means you have to A, know what attentiveness, intelligence, reason, rationality and responsibility are in yourself, because that's where the data are given initially. And then you need to be able to try to discern it in the products of other people's life and work. You got to try and figure. I mean, this is what the his account of the development of doctrine on the way to Nicaea is about, is trying to reconstruct um, the intellectual process, the intelligent process that's throwing up these positions. Right? People have questions and they're tossing out possible answers to them and then having to adjudicate the adequacy of those answers. Um, and the ultimate criterion of adequacy is is driven by the normative structure of the human mind. Yeah. Which on the one hand is like uh, you know, as a scholarly matter, that's really challenging. Um, but at a human level, it's not Foucault and incommensurable epistemes. You're not going to bump up against human worlds that are just closed to you. It might be hard, um, and you might be stymied by the irrationality and the immorality of communities and actors in communities that you encounter. Um, uh, but it's not just going to be a closed episteme in the way that like Foucault seems to think just happens, where you're going to just go, you're just not going to have any access to it. Lonergan's more humanist than that. He thinks, yeah, there's human minds operating here with relative levels of authenticity, and to the extent they're authentic, you'll be able to get some purchase on it, and to the extent that it's not authentic, it's not going to make any sense, and you'll have to have inverse insights and go, oh, nothing to be known here, just people doing dumb stuff.
Are there any historians who take up that model of studying historical events that you know of? And if so, how are they received?
There's some kind of intellectual philosophical historians in the Lonergan community. I'm blanking on one guy's name. If I think of it, I'll tell it to you. There was a scripture scholar, a Lonergan student who was quite a relatively accomplished scripture scholar, and in fact was one of Tom Wright's teachers, I think. Um,
Ben Meyer.
Ben Meyer, yeah, that's who I'm thinking of. Um, so Ben Meyer's work might be something to look at. Um, Gosh, what's this intellectual historian's name? I can't think of his name. I can see his face, um, but I can't think of his name. If I think of it, I'll tell it to you. I can't think. Tom, it's Tom something, but I can't think of his last name. Cool.
McPartland.
Yes, Tom McPartlin. That's right. That's what I'm thinking of. Okay. Could newer meanings be considered valid if it seems to contradict prior accepted meaning? Um, okay, so that's a good question. There's sort of different categories. So you can have meanings which are complementary to each other, which is to say, they're yeah, they're verbally different, but they're answering sort of sufficiently different questions that they're really just covering different territory. I think that's what the Joint Declaration on Justification came to, is that these facially seem like they're talking about the same thing, but actually they're sort of not actually non-overlapping. Uh, I should ask my friend Jacob who wrote the book on that. And then there's genetic differences where and this has to do with, like, if you like your Thomas Kuhn you can have genetic differences where you're asking a set of questions, and the set of questions sort of are coalescing into a set of answers that make a nice systematic framework. But you come to realize, right, you're Einstein, and you come to realize that Newton was wrong about absolute time and space. And you realize you actually need to ask a different set of questions about acceleration and mass and gravity and so on. Uh, and so you're going to get a set of answers which are genetically related to an earlier set of questions and answers, um, where you had a paradigm or a system that was developed around a certain scheme of questions. And in fact, in the process of asking and answering those questions, you set the conditions to be able to reframe your whole approach to the inquiry, and now you're going to generate, general and special relativity. And like, yeah, you continue to use Newtonian physics up to a certain point, but then you'll reach a limit and you got to shift paradigms and do it in a different way. Um, and then, but then there's also like real dialectically related or contradictory meanings, where like to affirm one necessitates negating the other. Um, and then it's a question of like which one is correct and which one is incorrect. And so, part of the difficulty of, there's a way in which Lonergan, Fred Lawrence at BC, intuited this early on. There's a certain respect in which Lonergan can be counted among the hermeneutical philosophers like Gadamer and Ricoeur and so on. Because insofar as you're investigating the world mediated by meaning and constituted by meaning, which is most of the world in which we do our human living, um, there's a kind of interpretive exercise where you're having to not only understand the various meanings that are in the kind of common fund that has aggregated over time, but you also have to be making these difficult judgments about the relationship between the meanings, right? Are these complementary? Are they genetically related in some way? And then you need genealogies to be able to map out the genetic relationships between the meanings, or are they just dialectically contradictory to one another? Um, and uh, and that's just like scholarly spade work. Um, yeah. It can be that occasionally, at least in the Catholic Church, occasionally the Vatican will come out and they'll repudiate previous um, magisterial pronouncements. Doesn't happen that often. They much prefer to just uh, you know say something new and preface it with, as the church has always and everywhere taught. Um, that's a little more the sort of, and everyone kind of goes, we know what he's doing. Um, but yeah, I mean, there are instances, usually on pretty serious moral failings. Um, the church will come out and go, yeah, that one wasn't right. That one was wrong, right? And then you're in that dialectical contradictory territory. Um, this is actually all right. Can I ride a hobby horse for a second? This is an intra-Catholic gripe, so forgive me if this is OTS to you, but um, there is a tendency among certain traditionalist types in Catholicism in the United States um, to invoke the word orthodox. Is he Orthodox? I'm Orthodox. I'm fairly Orthodox, right? And what they mean is not, do you affirm the first seven council, the like, the affirmations of the first seven councils. They don't mean, do you affirm without reservation the basic Christological and Trinitarian dogmas? What they mean is, do you hold a set of highly politically salient positions in moral theology pertaining to gender and sexuality? Um, and that's a catastrophe. Um, for orthodoxy to come to mean that, right? Because there used to be a thing in Catholic theology called theological notes, where there was a whole system for indicating the relative sort of the relative permanence or the relative fixity of certain magisterial pronouncements. That kind of went the way of the dodo with the Second Vatican Council, but I always say, make theological notes great again, because people need some sense of there is a hierarchy in terms of these affirmations of how fixedly they're taught, and so to take fraught and debatable matters like the Catholic moral teachings about gender and sexuality and elevate them to the level of being orthodox um, is some real cart before the horse stuff, um, in my professional opinion. Pat, you and I have talked about this before.
If I might just add, like our diocese, which if you're not Catholics, we're like the 22 counties in southeast Iowa, the southeastern quadrant of Iowa, 74 parishes, congregations, and through the synodal listening process, um, sort of asking, where's the Spirit calling us to today? Three themes were identified: welcoming and belonging, youth and family engagement, and church teaching and tradition. And we're currently preparing for that third year of church teaching and tradition. And it's like landmines all over the place because people get all sorts of uppity about what can be meant by church teaching and tradition. And almost none of it is grounded in historical awareness of the living tradition and how it develops. Um, so I was like super excited and still am at the end of the day that we're going to address this, but also it's like my hairline is receding not only because of my children, but also a professional hazard.
Yeah. Gosh. Well, Godspeed. Godspeed. Yeah. Doing the Lord's work, but gosh, I don't envy you sitting in those meetings. All
Just
right.
to nod to
Yes,
say
please.
what you're saying is real in
Oh,
Iowa,
yeah.
at least.
I have no
Probably
doubt.
elsewhere.
I have no doubt. Okay, we're coming up on time here. We ended up talking about the stuff that I wanted to make sure we touched on. So I don't have anything I want to circle back to, especially because your questions took us there anyway. So does anybody else have any last things that you want to make sure we come in contact with before we get out of here?
I can bring up one thing. Hopefully, it doesn't take us too far afield and doesn't take too long. But it occurred to me while we were rereading the passage earlier. This is back on page 214 of the article, or page 13 of the PDF. When he's talking about the systematic theologian who compares the various interpretations and theories that have been propounded and determines where his own preferences lie, that sounded like a quick collapsing of what he differentiates into different functional specialties in method and theology, and left me confused a little bit, I guess, because I know where he ends up in method and theology, or at least
Yeah.
some of it, where he would distinguish in method between the systematician or the systematic theologian and the historian, and the dialectician and so forth, as different moments in theology or specialties.
Yeah. So just I think what I would encourage you to do, I can answer this is a boring but fast answer, is read him as invoking the two, because method. Read him as invoking the two phases there. That was it synecdoche where you bring in the part for the whole?
Yep.
That each of those are synecdoche for the mediating phase and the mediated phase,
Yeah.
respectively. This was given the same year Method and Theology came out. So yeah, he's gesturing at those
Got it.
big things there. Good.
Thank you.
Good question. Cool. Any other last things? I don't want anyone to feel like we left them in the dust on this.
I just want to say, Jonathan, you're very generous to send me your the article you wrote on statistically ordered, and it To the point we're talking about permanence of doctrine and the theological notes, it seems to me Lonergan is able to refine our own appropriation of how we know things, and that changes the way in which we're able to understand moral realities. And so part of the issue to me is like Pat, what you're saying at your parish is like the tacit philosophy underneath people's thinking about orthodoxy creates a tension that's just not that doesn't have substance. I mean, it's real, but if people got underneath some of those tacit assumptions, we might find more agreement.
Yeah, and and the hope would be, right? I mean, the title of this class is, Lonergan and the problem of progress in theology. It's um, how uh, how do we understand better? Um, and so yeah, so yes, there is Anselm's Fides Cogens Intellectum, certainly, but uh, how do we um how do we continue to take hold of what's handed on to us from from Christ and the apostles, and then and fit and both understand it on its own terms, but also then integrate that with our understanding of the world. And on top of that, um, how do we affect the in that essay, Dialectic of Authority, Lonergan talks about the cooperation that's down the ages, right? How do we let our generation be one that deepens understanding and then is able to communicate that deepening to another generation so that they have a platform from which to take it even deeper, right? How do we continue to accumulate and progress uh, aggregations and systematizing of understanding? Um, and it is really one of those things. I mean, it's a little bit like, um, you know, it's a little like going to the gym in that, like, yeah, you can go to the gym and maintain. Uh, you can go to the gym and make progress and get more strong. But if you don't go to the gym, it's not like you're just going to stay, right? You're not going to maintain stasis. You're going to atrophy. And so one of the real challenges is like there have all these generations before us that have made insights, have answered questions. And so there's both in a community's life, in one generation's lifetime in a community to be able to appropriate um, as much as we can from previous generations' efforts, and then also to make advances and hopefully hand them on. I mean, gosh, even just to even just to sort of make the adequate appropriations and then hand them on without even if you don't make any advances is an enormous lift. I mean, I feel it acutely as a university professor. Um, I'm of the studied position that more understanding is always better, that the principle of situations getting better instead of getting worse is understanding. Um, and uh, not only my students, but sometimes it seems like the people who run these institutions aren't on the same page. Right? Credentialing is the whole ball game. And so, if we can collect tuitions and get people enough credits that they will continue to, um, you know, that we can keep our accreditation so that we can keep giving credentials so that people can keep putting our name on resumes to get jobs. And as long as the GDP keeps growing, cool, right? We're doing our job. Um, and for those of us who think you can do all that and not even begun to have done your job, it's troubling. And then, right, so that's the general case, and then the specific case in theology is, um, gen, you know, group bias for Lonergan isn't just like racism or something, though it is that. But group bias really is like if the ideas that I associate with the fellow feeling of being a part of this community, in this case, an ecclesial community. Um, if I feel like if those ideas change, right? If they deepen, if they grow, if they're revised by being put into a new paradigm, whatever, if I learn anything, then my community is under threat. My sense of fellow feeling is under threat. I mean, and that's where you get religious anti-intellectualism. I mean, I think Lonergan's analysis is a very thinly veiled critique of religious anti-intellectualism. That if anything changes at all, we won't be us anymore. Um,
And is that the insight that that's not true, or the belief, the coming to the internal belief that that isn't something we have to be afraid about, which I suspect most of us on this class aren't afraid of that.
yeah.
Is that the religious conversion? I don't think that's there. Is it the moral conversion or the intellectual conversion? Where does that fall in that?
Um,
Or is that the wrong question?
no, it's an interesting question. So I think what you would have to say is that part of intellectual conversion is um, to have trust that it will be good for my community if we understand better, right? That the way that we stay together is by having our circumstances improve and not deteriorate. Because what pulls us apart is the deterioration of our circumstances. Um, and so, what's the principle of an improved situation? Understanding. Um, and so, one has to have a kind of faith that if the ideas are good, we can work out how to integrate our community life around being organized by better ideas because it'll be better for everyone.
Or even if there are bad ideas, faith that we'll be able to figure out that they're bad
Yeah.
ideas.
Yeah. Lonergan says authenticity most of the
Right.
time involves, in the first instance, a withdrawal from inauthenticity. So yeah, if we identify that we as a group have been living a common life organized around misapprehensions, that it's actually better for the community for us to repudiate those misapprehensions than to not. That would be intellectual conversion as well. Yeah.
So we just have to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, and it turns out, right, that self-appropriation. I always feel bad sort of invoking this Lonerganism, but what Lonergan means by self-appropriation, right, is coming to know the normative structure of your own mind. I always say that it puts you in touch with the sort of inner weather vane, and I'll use that language in lots of different contexts. Um, but the thing that's implicit in that is. What is the wind that the weather vane is registering? It's the Holy Spirit, right? It's the Ruach of God. Um, and it's in you. You have that weather vane in you in the normative structure of your own mind. Um, and so if you can learn how to because you've objectified it, to use that objectification to stay in touch with it in real time, you can be a principle of progress and redemption. Instead of one of the myriad agents of decline. And most of us are a little of both. The wheat and the tares grow up together. This is the last thing, and then I'll let you go. I was teaching a course at St. Edward's University, and I had asked my boss, a guy named Steve Rodenborn, who's now a dean or something at Salve Regina. I asked him to come observe me teaching because I was applying to a lot of jobs. I was on a visiting position, and I was teaching the Exodus. And I was dramatizing the narrative of the Hebrews leaving Egypt and having the Egyptian empire behind them, and having the sea in front of them, right? That they have pernicious order behind them and the chaotic waters in front of them, right? Good ancient Near Eastern dramatic circumstances. Um, and we got through it, and I talked about the way in which then, right, the God of the Hebrews, what does the God of the Hebrews do? a wind, a ruach, comes and puts order into the chaotic waters to allow them to pass through. And after I did this, I dismissed the class, and my cradle Catholic teacher came up to me and he goes, "You haven't always been Catholic, have you?" I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "The way you talk about Bible stories, you haven't always been Catholic." I said, "Well, yeah, maybe I was an evangelical for 3 of those decades I've been alive." He goes, "I knew it." So anyway, if in case you're wondering if these biblical references are got come by honestly, they are. All right. Thanks, y'all. Any last things? I don't want to cut anybody off. Let's look real quick at what we have for next time. I've now misplaced my Canvas page. Where is it? Here we go. So for next time, we have two of my favorite essays, both given in 1968. Actually, both given within like a 10-day period in 1968. Absence of God in Modern Culture and Belief Today's Issue. So we're gonna zoom in on Lonergan asking the question of method in modern theology more directly next time. So if you were having fun doing Christology and Trinitarian theology, apologies, those are not going to show up as much. Okay?
Jonathan, thank you. You're soaring to great heights here. So
Thanks, man.
every time this community meets, I think it's only in this format, in this day and age, that this sort of conversation is going to take place.
Could be.
You have a kind of brilliance that this particular group of people, I think, can fully appreciate, and it's
Well,
perhaps
that's very kind. I'm grateful that you all show up prepared and with good questions because I couldn't do it without those. So, all
You're
right,
very
guys.
much appreciated. I hope you know.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right, I'm gonna go to St. Patrick's Day dinner at my parish.
See everybody next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Next week.
Adios.
Thanks.
John. Thanks,
Bye.
Paul. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Paul.
How you doing, Brian?
Hey, I'm good. I don't know how to exit this thing. Oh, there it is. There's the leave button, but I'm talking to you now, so I ain't gonna leave.
Well, I see you got a new look.
I got some glasses that are much stronger in their magnification for up close. But